But anyway, since then, we just posted the last installment this morning of Is China an Imperialist Country from 2014 by N.B. Turner. This, all in all, is just shy of about 6 hours, and it's 24 chapters plus an appendix. Very, I thought, detailed, data-based, data-driven breakdown of China's exports of capital and overall imperialist behavior from a Marxist-Leninist standpoint. Unequivocally, yes, China is an imperialist country. A lot of people engaging with this weren't engaging with it sort of on the best terms. And what the essay or book repeatedly discusses is when we talk about imperialism, we're talking about it in Marxist-Leninist terms. So what did Lenin call imperialism? He wrote a whole book called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which we'll be doing shortly. I'll actually show you the upcoming reading list in just a few minutes. But Lenin described imperialism as, in a nutshell, monopoly capitalism, the stage of capitalism in which basically capitalism is established and the consolidations are underway such that major trusts, or what we could call now multinational corporations, very large industrial and financial merged, what's called finance capital, when financial capital and industrial capital become so intertwined that they effectively become one thing called finance capital. The emergence of finance capital, what we would call the military-industrial complex, basically when the home market is saturated. In early capitalism, the capitalists are still fighting for their national market and the establishment of the nation per se, which exists in a different way prior to capitalism and feudalism. But the capitalists fight to establish that home market for their goods. And then once that home market is saturated, they need to pursue opportunities for profit outside of it. Okay, and so they do export capital to other advanced capitalist, monopoly capitalist, or capitalist imperialist countries. But they, beyond that, and in fact, that can even be the majority of what they do, is exporting capital to each other's countries. But they also seek underdeveloped or developing, what's sometimes called third world countries, to export capital to and to exploit in that way. So, Lenin had a list of criteria, and this book basically makes the case that there is a world imperialist system that emerged after World War II. In the older system of colonialism, it would be the case that particular colonies would be the exclusive property of one capitalist power or the other. However, that wasn't as stable because the capitalists would wind up fighting over who had access to what. So after World War II, they set up this system where they could basically share in the exploitation, that the developing or exploited countries weren't the exclusive domain of one imperialist or the other, but of the world imperialist system in which the various imperialist countries would participate according to their size and strength. And of course, that's unequal because everything in capitalism is unequal, including the way that the capitalist imperialists divide up the loot. But the export of capital being a major determining factor, Lenin said that that becomes of primary importance. Does China export capital? Yes, lots of it. It's also either the second largest or the largest economy in the world. It is characterized by monopoly capital and so on. A lot of people in the comments just not really engaging with this and being like, well, the global south likes it. Who in the global south, anyway, there's so much more to this. Once you peel back the layers of Dungist third worldism theory, or three worlds theory, where basically class struggle in the developing world is just papered over in favor of, we'll just forget about class struggle within a country and, the bourgeoisie within an exploited or developing country gets to just speak for that country. Well, that's not really, where our analysis should stop as Marxists, yet in the Dungist three worlds theory, that is kind of how that goes. Anyway, we're going to read those in depth. Let me switch, in fact, to the reading list. Was thinking of doing this later, but let me just go ahead and do it now. So this was my thank you post to people who stepped up on the Patreon and the buy me a coffee situation. So here is the upcoming reading list, and we're going to continue with this question of Chinese capitalism. So as I wrote, this is in the YouTube community posts, by the way. If you are unaware of their existence, just go to the community tab. So I wrote, I'm currently partway through recording Is China an Imperialist Country from 2014 by N.B. Turner et al., which will be featured in the it will be the next video posted. I will immediately follow this with 2 supplementary pieces, and then Enver Hoxha's Imperialism and the Revolution from 1978, which is on the same basic subject as the Turner piece, what's called Dungism, named after Deng Xiaoping, or the return of capitalism to China after the death of Mao Zedong. So the upcoming texts, which will be recorded and posted with no delays, and I have indeed been trucking through them. The first one is now done, Is China an Imperialist Country by N.B. Turner et al. Then A Caricature of Marxism and Imperialist Economism by Lenin from 1916. Then to sort of, go to the source of what is this Dengist Three Worlds theory, often referred to as campism now, although campism used to be like more of a valid concept when there was a socialist camp. It's not even that. It's like degraded campism, but more accurately called Dengist Three Worlds theory. So anyway, Chairman Mao's theory of the differentiation of the three worlds. It's a very long title. I put an ellipsis there. From 1977 by the editorial department of the People's Daily. We will read that. So basically after Mao died, this is the year after Mao died, basically the capitalist roaders headed by Deng Xiaoping attributed their three worlds theory to Mao, and Mao being dead, he could not really argue with them. Whether this is actually the brainchild of Mao Zedong or not is, I think, not really well established. I don't think that there's clear evidence either way. There is some evidence that in 1974, Mao made some reference to this, but there was never like a major expository piece where Mao said, here is my new three worlds theory, blah, blah, blah. It was all really introduced posthumously, and one wonders how much Maoist content really was in there. The people who call themselves Maoists today, in the sense of Marxist-Leninist Maoists, do not accept this and consider it part of Dengism, what they see as revisionist capitalist restoration. But anyway, we want to read it to know what we're talking about when we go into the fourth reading, Imperialism and the Revolution, from the next year, 1978, by Enver Hoxha. So Hoxha was the leader of Albania, Socialist Albania, which was real big on Marxism-Leninism when the USSR was still Marxist-Leninist, really was displeased with the turn under Khrushchev. And so Hoxha then pivoted towards China and was a great ally of China in late 50s and 60s and so on. In the 70s, started becoming more critical of some things, and then very critical, similar to how Marxist-Leninist Maoists are, but from just a Marxist-Leninist position, because also started wondering, well, where did this come from in China, and started basically criticizing the Communist Party of China as maybe not having formed Marxism-Leninism properly, and became more critical towards Mao. So that's one of the differences between Marxism-Leninism, anti-revisionist Marxism-Leninism as exemplified by, say, Hoxha, versus anti-revisionist Marxism-Leninism in the MLM or Marxist-Leninist Maoist strain. So I think understanding those differences is important. At the end of the day, probably, anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninists who would agree with Hoxha on many questions would also agree with MLMs on most major, important questions. So, we want to recognize the differences while not over-accentuating them. But anyway, Hoxha's take on this, that we did a month or two ago, another piece by Hoxha about, or actually a couple of them by Hoxha from this time period, late 70s, criticizing what was going on in China at the time, basically the end of the Cultural Revolution and the rise of the capitalist roader faction, and sort of the end of socialist construction as it had been going under Mao. So following that, I had some series planned involving Rosa Luxemburg series, and then also going back to early Marx and Engels, with all of the crazy shit going on of people not understanding what imperialism is, and all of this stuff, I want to just finish the basic ML study guide playlist. There's 3 things left on it. They're right there. Anti-Ideering Part 2, Political Economy by Engels. Capital Volume 1 by Marx, which I'll be posting chapter by chapter, with a lot of comments so people can understand it. And Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Lenin. That is the last thing. Well, there's also a thing from Movimiento Anti-Imperialista, which made this syllabus, about a theory of reconstitution of the Communist Party. I will read that as well. But basically, I wanted to get up to that Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and I really wanted to read this thing in order. So, the good news is we did. We read it in order. The bad news is it did take a while, but I think we've gained a lot from all the side readings. So once that's done, I will go back to the Rosa and the other playlists that I wanted to do, occasionally bumping up some of the Hoja pieces from like the American Party of Labor, for example. But I do know Finball dropped a comment, the Finnish Bolshevik, who also does theory readings as well as just educational video essays about Marxism-Leninism, did drop a comment to let me know that he is currently recording The Khrushchevites by Hoja. Hoja was an anti-revisionist who had some for the Titoists, had some for the Khrushchevites, had some for the Dungists, really had extensive criticisms of all of the different forms of revisionism that were developing in the second half of the 20th century. And yeah, Albania is a small country. Their socialism could not sort of hold its ground on its own. They did go down when everything else did go down. But I think that I think Hoja's insights into what was going on in the 50s, 60s, and 70s are valuable. I think he had some pretty useful insights for understanding the setup of the neoliberal era that we're in now. Late 70s, really following the double dip recession, major recession in the late 70s that arguably was the material basis for ushering in the neoliberal turn. So anyway, important to kind of get the perspective, I think, of people who were there at the time, had a good working knowledge of Marxism-Leninism, and were watching these changes unfolding right before their eyes. So anyway, that's what's coming up. On the China thing, I did want to give 2 other pieces before moving on to the next thing, which we had a comment from somebody, and then also basically 2 critical things. So where did I put the comment about China? All right, there it is. So this is a comment, and I took out the person's name. I'm not looking for people to, go bully people. But I thought this was one of the more thoughtful kinds of objections to the 4-part book by N.B. Turner that I posted. They wrote, "It appears that the main argument in this essay, again, is China an imperialist country, hinges on proving," and by the way, I just want to also point out, a lot of people did not listen to this, did not read it, posted comments anyway. For all they know, the answer to the question could have been, no, it isn't. Now, yeah, I mean, spoiler alert, yes, Turner was making the case that, yes, China is an imperialist country. But some people don't even like that question being asked. They didn't even know what the answer was, but they reacted strongly just to the question having been asked. Anyway, this commenter said, "It appears that the main argument in this essay hinges on proving that the Chinese state is controlled by the Chinese bourgeoisie." And let me stop you right there. That's not really at all what it is. It's describing the overall economic, political, military, and other behavior by China over decades, and just describing it. What is the best description of it? Is it imperialism in the Leninist sense, or is it socialism? And I think unequivocally it is imperialism in the Leninist sense. And if you're not using the Leninist sense, then I don't really care, like what you say, because it's subjective otherwise. Anyway, I just read Roland Bohr's book, Socialism with Chinese Characteristics, which argues that the Chinese state is not controlled by the bourgeoisie, but by the masses, led by the Communist Party of China cadre, whose goal is to resolve current contradictions to achieve communism. I'd be interested to hear or read critiques of Bohr's arguments if you want to do a read-through of it and then critique it, or if anyone has critiques of the book's arguments issued by other principled revolutionaries. I think principled is not really so much, knowledgeable would be more the, the criterion I'd be looking for there. But I have not read this book. I did look up Roland Bohr. He's a theologian. That's his primary training, who is now an apologist for Chinese capitalism. I mean, that's not impressive to me off the bat. I maybe can take a look at this at some point, but you can argue anything. You know, the point is, can you back it up with evidence? Like, I can argue that DNA is actually made out of cotton candy, but like, you know, do I have any evidence to that effect? You can say that the Chinese state is led by the masses. Okay. I mean, let's just follow through the logic. So what the data in this essay point out is that China is imperialist by any definition of, you know, Leninist definition of the term. They meet all the criteria for it and are moving into a position where they may even be, at some point in the next decade or two, taking over from the U.S. as one of the military upholders of the world imperialist system. They're already laying the groundwork for that now. So what are we trying to say? This is like the people's imperialism? In other words, if you're saying that the masses are directing this imperialist activity, you're saying what? They're exploiting themselves by having, you know, letting Chinese corporations off the leash to not operate based on an economic plan, but primarily with regard to the market and profits. It's the people's capitalism. This is just, that's such a mess if you're trying to go down. You know, it's one thing to say that socialism is a transitional state with some contradictions still left in it. Yeah, okay. That's such a tangled mess. It's completely just self-defeating. Anyway. So continuing, this essay by N.B. Turner raises some important critiques and highlights some glaring contradictions that should be discussed. But in 2023, I've yet to see a consensus amongst active global South socialist orgs that China is imperialist. Again, you know, I don't know what organizations you're talking about. I don't know if they are revisionist, and I don't know if we should care. In other words, are they doing Marxist-Leninist analysis? And I'm in united fronts with several large principled global South socialist internationalist organizations. Well, I'll take your word on that. But I replied by saying that China is unequivocally imperialist in the Marxist-Leninist sense, as very clearly demonstrated in this book, over 6 hours, examining capital exports and other behavior by Chinese capital. If the global South socialist orgs are revisionist or just not Marxist-Leninist, then they may not be evaluating its imperialism on this basis, but on some anti-Leninist basis. So I think that the commenter reasonably did respond, said, I don't disagree with the conclusion that Chinese capital is imperialist based on imperialism as described by Lenin. Okay, then we agree. I don't know what the argument is at that point. So you agree the organizations that don't think that are not correct? Okay, we agree then. So anyway, I replied to that and I said, well, that's the only relevant standard for Marxist-Leninists. And by the way, correct me if I'm wrong, but China claims to be Marxist-Leninist, right? So if you and I can figure this out, and China is China and has access to even more data about all the capital they're exporting, etc., than we do, then shouldn't they also reach the conclusion that China is imperialist, as described by Lenin? Because, again, they're Marxist-Leninists. That's the standard they claim to hold themselves to, and that... So anyway, you see what I'm saying here. That was one of the better comments. There were, you know, a lot of other ones that were just sort of insults or whatever. One guy like, oh, this is Trotskyist. What are you even talking about? Something stages of socialism. I'm like, bro, you just didn't even listen to this at all, clearly. So anyway, no respect for that. But I did, from the Maoist perspective, also find another comment that I wanted to bring in. So this is a short commentary from Pao-Yu Ching. People may recognize that name from the book From Victory to Defeat, published by foreignlanguages.press, which also has a YouTube channel, which I just added, along with Radical Reads, to the channels tab. If you're looking for other channels that I think are reasonably good, that either do audiobooks or Marxist analysis or history or whatever, check out the channels tab. It's a range of people. And actually, there's a couple of ones that are more related to the pandemic, like Data Report, Status Coup, or the People's CDC. Most of them, the overwhelming majority, are Marxist-Leninist, doing audiobooks and doing pretty good educational stuff. So go to the channels tab on YouTube if you want to see some other links that will be some reasonable food for thought without having to stumble through too much crap. All right. So anyway, Pao-Yu Ching, author of From Victory to Defeat, talking about the reversal of socialism in China after Mao. Some critical comments on the N.B. Turner document. So this is what another Maoist had to say about this Maoist document. And I would say, you know, having read this whole thing now, it's 6 hours long, these are like, I would say, minor notes overall. And some of them are just arguably not really within the scope of the original document. Not that they're not valid points. You could definitely expand the analysis and cover the points that Pao-Yu Ching raises. Anyway, let's read. So this is from 2015. On March 9th, 2014, the Red Path website, red-path.net, posted an article by N.B. Turner entitled, "Is China an Imperialist Country? Considerations and Evidence." In the introduction, the author said that all revolutionaries need to clarify the nature of imperialism today, and revolutionary internationalism must take aim at and organize forces with clear understanding that revolution requires opposition to the entire capitalist imperialist system. I fully agree with this statement. It is indeed necessary to intensify our struggle against imperialism with the conviction and determination to win. However, I respectfully disagree with the approach N.B. Turner has taken in this paper. My criticisms are as follows. And again, like I said, I was a little underwhelmed by this, but I thought I would read it because it's topical. So point 1 out of 3, Turner's views on the imperialist system. Turner describes the imperialist system by focusing almost entirely on which countries are qualified as participants of the imperialist system. Partly true, but he also describes the characteristics of it. Anyway, according to Turner, the current list of participants are, and again, I don't know that that was stated in absolute terms, but definitely these countries were mentioned. The United States, Britain, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, Russia, China. Turner also lists Holland, Belgium, Canada, Australia, and South Korea as having benefited from the imperialist system by, quote, sharing the plunder of the less economically developed countries and in the joint exploitation of the working people of the whole world that the system makes possible, unquote. In Turner's imperialist system, Brazil and India comprise a third group of countries that he calls would-be imperialist countries or sub-imperialist. He describes the ruling classes of Brazil and India as having ambitions to become imperialist countries without the ability, and that was, I think, heavily qualified at, as of 2014, without the ability to fulfill those ambitions. There was extensive discussion of that, talking about the differences between the comprador and national capitalists not being that big, that in the end they sort of have to work together politically anyway. So there was, I thought, pretty good, well-qualified discussion of that. Turner does not concisely define nor describe countries that are exploited by the imperialist system. The paper implies that if a country is not on the list of participants or one that is benefiting from the system, then it is exploited by the system. So I have to disagree with that. I think it was just not the point of the paper to go into all of that explicitly. The title of the paper is, its thesis question, is China an imperialist country? That's primarily what the paper was concerned with. I thought that it answered that question admirably. And I actually disagree with the statement that the paper implies if a country is not on the list of participants, then it is being exploited. I don't think that was a major question raised in the paper, so I'm not really sure why this is getting such focus. Turner explains that as far as the sub-imperialist countries are concerned, it is incorrect to view them, like India and Brazil, as, quote, no longer being exploited by foreign imperialism, or as having become full-fledged imperialist countries themselves. Quite the contrary, their major aspect is still as countries dominated and exploited by foreign imperialism, unquote. The method Turner uses to separate the exploiter from the exploited, with a third group of half-exploited countries, is not only confusing but also subjective. What determines the main aspect of a country's relationship to the imperialist system? How do we determine if a country has become full-fledged imperialist from those that are not full-fledged? What is the threshold a country needs to cross to become a full-fledged imperialist country? He does not discuss what that threshold is or how to cross it, nor does he explain why that threshold is actually crossable. In other words, Turner implies that given time, the main aspect of Brazil and India's relationship of domination and exploitation by foreign imperialism can be transformed somehow into minor aspects. I mean, yes, that's, I think, I really find some of these criticisms like odd. Part of them I thought were just outside of the scope of what the paper was investigating. And then part of them are just not, they're answerable questions, but not relevant in that maybe if there were examples of such countries, they weren't, would have bogged down the paper too much to put it in. Anyway, I mean, they're sort of reasonable questions, but I think that this implies that it's a much sloppier paper than it actually was. I thought it was concise and made its points clearly. It stuck to the topic without skimming over things. I think if it had gotten into a lot of these questions, which were a bit more side questions, again, they were focused on China. It's not hard to make the case that China is imperialist. That's mainly what they were determined to do. Getting into a whole side discussion of this, I just don't really think was that germane. But anyway, none of these points are sufficiently explained. So I would actually argue that they were sufficiently explained. They wouldn't have been sufficiently explained if the title of the piece was, what is the future of Brazil and India, and what constitutes a sub-imperialist country versus an imperialist country. If that was the title of the paper and the main topic that they're attempting to explore, then yeah, it would have been insufficient. But I think by this argument to sort of engage in some hyperbole here, it's like you could argue that the paper didn't sufficiently examine the aerodynamics of like rollerbladers wearing one type of helmet versus another. I mean, it's true they didn't get into that. It's also not definitely not in that case the topic of the paper, but I think, again, also, I would push back on that, just saying, like, that wasn't really what we were trying to go into in the paper. Anyway, 2, Turner's view on economic development. Turner's article does not provide any overall analysis of China's current economy. Time out. I'm very confused by that statement. They gave many statistics about China's overall economy. I don't really know what that statement means, to be honest, because I thought they did. So I'm curious to hear what exactly they were looking for and why they thought it was missing. Continuing, or how and under what conditions China has been incorporated into the global capitalist system. Time out. Absolutely incorrect. Absolutely incorrect. They talk about China's initiation into the WTO and the IMF. All of that is actually discussed at length. I have no idea where Pao-Yu Ching is coming from here. So anyway, or the consequences of that incorporation on China and the Chinese people. Again, that is discussed. So, again, and also how many hours did you want this thing to be? So as far as criticism, of to the extent that I think that these things are valid, these criticisms are valid, I think that they fall more under the category of questions for additional research rather than actual shortcomings of this paper. You know what I mean? Like some of these are valid questions, and you could do additional follow-up research on that to dive into more detail. I think it's too harsh to say that it's a shortcoming of the original paper, because it made its point, and how long did you want this thing to be? But anyway, instead it presents figures including high rates of export and GDP growth, rapid increases in manufacturing production, increasing trade surpluses, and large foreign exchange reserves as measures to show China's economic strength. However, before neoliberal ideology became dominant in the 1980s, there were many discussions among the developmental, even bourgeois economists, seriously questioning the use of those measures to determine the level of economic development of less developed countries. But that era has long passed, and Wall Street has taken over as the authority on economic development, forcibly promoting neoliberal ideology together with concrete neoliberal policies. So, again, I'm just not really sure. They did make a case in terms that will be understandable to anybody who understands capitalism and the current world imperialist market system, that China is a full participant and one of the largest participants in that system. I think that's all they were setting out to do. And I just read this thing word for word, so I read some things sometimes that I'm heavily critical of and have a lot of critical comments about. I just don't. I'm more inclined to defend this. I'm not really sure where they're coming from. But continuing, neoliberal ideology has equated economic development exclusively with growth in GDP and exports, trade surpluses, and the size of foreign exchange reserves. Trade organizations such as the World Trade Organization and financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and World Bank Group have used their power to enforce policies of opening up markets of less developed countries to foreign trade and foreign investment, reforming their institutions, liberalizing their outdated in quotes, restrictive regulations, deregulating their banks and financial institutions, and privatizing their inefficient, again in quotes, nationally owned enterprises. This widely propagated law of development dictates, from a neoliberal perspective, dictates that each country should exploit its comparative advantage and promote exports at all cost. Once a country completes the above reforms and obeys the international rules for trade and investment, its exports will take off, and growth in employment and GDP will follow. Well, this book absolutely did walk through all of that in detail. And as far as the removing regulations on banks and financial institutions, they talked about the state-owned enterprises in China being made to act more like private corporations. Many, like probably 10 separate chapters of the book that gets brought up. I'm not really understanding what Pao-Yu Ching's alternative vision for this. If you could give Pao-Yu Ching the red pen and let them go to town on this, like, I'm not sure what they would have made instead, but I think it just would have been a different paper with different research questions. Again, for what the paper set out to do, I thought it handled admirably. If you want to add to it, like, feel free. But as they continue with this sort of harsh criticism, Turner's flawed view on economic development is clarified in his assessment of the NIC's newly industrialized countries' experiences as positive. I need a page number on that. This is a little strange to me. The NICs were pioneers in the export-led growth strategy of development. Imperialists used them as showcases to promote neoliberal ideology and policies. China's capitalist reformer, Deng Xiaoping, was inspired by the NIC's, quote, achievements, which led him to taking decisive actions to dissolve China's socialist economy and linking China with the global capitalist system. Again, this was discussed, and I don't remember it being discussed in a positive light. So, yeah, I kind of don't know what they're talking about, but for what it's worth, there's two other screens here. In spite of what may be growth in exports and increases in GDP, the consequences of the neoliberal development strategy on the less developed countries have been devastating. Absolutely, I'm just surprised that they think that Turner was arguing against that. I didn't get that for 1 second reading this text. People in these countries have suffered not only from selling their labor power at low wages in the new International Division of Labor, again discussed repeatedly in the book, they've also lost valuable natural resources and suffered from the pollution of their land, water, and air. Everyone knows this. Moreover, they have to endure repeated economic crises shifted to them by global monopoly capital, right? As a result, anti-imperialist movements in many less developed countries have put up strong resistance to their governments implementing these policies. I believe that in order to resist the expansion of global monopoly capital and the pressures exerted by imperialist countries, those on the left need to challenge this dominant ideology and expose all the serious consequences of these policies on the less developed countries and their people. And so this is so bizarre to me. I would really like a quote on this. Turner not only holds up the NICs and China as successful examples of the neoliberal capitalist model of development. What? I mean, they're successful in that they became, they're successful in capitalist terms. I don't think, they talk repeatedly in the book about how this is a departure from socialism. It's exploiting China's heavily exploited working class. They call for, Maoist revolution at the end. I don't know what the fuck this person is talking about. I really, really don't. And I just finished reading this thing yesterday. Anyway, he also fails to challenge the measures used by Wall Street. So literally multiple times in the book, including in the conclusion, it's one of the main theses of it that a true socialist revolution pulls the country that has their social revolution out of the world imperialist market system and basically makes it not for sale. and then calls for countries to do this. Why would you do that if you thought that neoliberal capitalism was success? You obviously wouldn't. So this just doesn't hold water for like 2 seconds. I find this so bizarre. Anyway, the imperialist organizations and neoliberal economists to gauge economic development. In this article, he uses these measures repeatedly as proof of China's economic strength. I mean, in capitalist terms, in its ability to participate in the world imperialist system, yes, not as an endorsement of that system. That's so bizarre to me. And if anyone in the chat right now has some, what am I missing here? But I'm not seeing it. Anyway, the right has seized the, quote, successful experiences of the NICs to attack Marxism and Leninism. Staffan Burenstam said in his book, The Pacific Century, quote, the Asian NICs are delivering a second shock to Marxism. I mean, yeah, just like Dungus revisionism did, but that doesn't mean like it's a good thing. Anyway, not only does it remain clear that contrary to what Marx claimed, advanced capitalism can avoid disintegration. Again, that's not a point that's claimed at any point in this book. It has also been demonstrated that, contrary to the neo-Marxists' claim, newcomers can rise by means of capitalism, unquote. And so here's a completely false statement. Turner's analysis seems to be in complete agreement with Bernstam on the successful capitalist development of Taiwan, South Korea, and other NICs. Time out. Turner, I think Turner's a pseudonym for a group of people, I'm not sure, but Turner explicitly talks about South Korea as a propped up capitalist project by the US and Japan specifically to keep communism from getting a foothold in that area. I have no idea where Pao-Yu Ching is coming from in this, like literally none at all. Anyway, it includes China in the list of countries that have, quote, successfully developed capitalism under imperialism. In capitalist terms, they did successfully develop capitalism. What are you talking about? There's a whole section about development. Is it possible under capitalism? And yeah, you can have different metrics for that. Development of stable housing, development of heavy industry. There's different metrics for that. Again, I never for a second got the impression while reading this book that they were promoting this NIC experience. And I would love some quotations to that effect. Anyway, Turner does not preclude the possibility that countries such as Brazil and India can follow suit. I mean, yes, by taking advantage of the world imperialist system to exploit other countries as well as the domestic. I mean, are we now saying that capitalism cannot result in any development? This goes back to Marx and Engels. Of course it does. Of course it results in a certain amount of development, but it is unstable and it trends toward a final crisis and all the other, problems that lead us to be Marxists. But I literally just, where are they coming from? They're not using any quotes to substantiate what they're, claiming to criticize about this book. Turner's analysis implies that Lenin was wrong. Show me, man. Like, show me. What are you talking about? Propagandists on the right claim that the neoliberal capitalist development worked for the NICs and is now working for China. I mean, it worked in capitalist terms. It worked for the Chinese bourgeoisie. It made them very rich. I don't think this book was ever trying to make any other point than that. What are you talking about? This is one of the biggest ideological victories capitalism has claimed, capitalism has achieved in its highest stage of development. Okay, I mean, the actual socialist movement collapsed to revisionism for a variety of reasons. I would say that was indeed a victory. What arose in its wake was Dungist type restoration of capitalism. But show me a quote where this book is cheering that on. Anyway, 3. According to Turner, neither China nor the Chinese people are exploited. Not true. It refers to the exploited Chinese working class repeatedly. I agree with Turner that imperialism is a system. Okay, there was a lot of vitriol in point 1 about putting imperialist system in quotes, like to mock it almost. Now we're agreeing that imperialism is a system, all right? And that the United States is not the only imperialist country in the world. Yeah, I mean, the United States is the military arm of imperialism and the most dominant country. It's the one that's responsible for maintaining the military presence required to keep it in place. But as the book makes the argument, China is playing an integral part by buying up the debt that helps the system to keep running, et cetera. And it may have to take over for more. It's also, the main manufacturing hub. So it's playing a crucial role within the imperialist system. Anyway, I also think that China has been pillaging resources and exploiting people in other less developed countries. However, I do not think we should focus our attention on speculating whether China will become an imperialist power on par with the United States. I mean, that's just talking about the future of the system. Why wouldn't you want to know that? And it's not a very far away future either. And remember, this was written in 2015. We're in a different position now, just 8 years later. And, life comes at you fast. Like, yeah, you kind of do have to keep up with this. As such, China's left must have an internationalist view and oppose what its bourgeois government has been doing in other less developed countries. We agree. However, I disagree with Turner that China and Chinese people are no longer exploited by imperialism. It would be super helpful if they were like quoting the article, because I just don't know what they're talking about. Turner rightly reminds us that we cannot let China's past shame and suffering blind us from seeing China's current reality, but we also cannot be blind to China's current day realities from the perspective of its people and environment. The exploitation and destruction unleashed on China and its people since the bourgeois regime began its reform 30 plus years ago. I mean, I don't know if I read, the date on the book that I read was 2014, so a year before these criticisms came out. My mind is going to did I read the revised version? But I don't think I did. I don't know what this author, this critic is talking about, because literally every point either was addressed, and I'd say the majority of them were addressed, and they're just kind of strawmanning it here bizarrely, to a really steep and bizarre extent. Or, they're raising issues that I think are valid, topics for additional research, but are, arguably not, aren't lacking for not having been included in this. Anyway, they're accusing Turner of being you don't think China's being exploited by capitalism? Of course they are. What the hell are you talking about? Anyone who knows anything about capitalism takes that for granted, and it is discussed as well. But again, this is a document written for Maoists, people who already have studied Marxism. To what extent do you need to break that down in great detail? Weird amount of vitriol here. Well, anyway, we're almost done. In the larger paper from which this article draws, I describe how the reform exploited and repressed Chinese workers. That is again discussed in the book. Depleted China's natural resources, destroyed China's environment, and thoroughly distorted China's economy. There's a link. In this new phase of imperialism, as a country, China's land, resources, environment, and people have not been exempted from imperialist exploitation. For these reasons, the Chinese people's anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist struggles are becoming increasingly active and are in fact an important component of the global anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist struggle. Holding the view that China is an exploited country is not a narrow nationalist view in defense of the Chinese bourgeois regime. Rather, it is an internationalist view that recognizes the necessity of including the most active people's struggles in China in our global anti-imperialist struggle. Again, they're sort of angrily making points that I don't think anybody involved with the authorship of this document would really take issue with. I just don't know where this is coming from. Except there's this point. Are they trying to... And so first of all, the title of the section I think is incorrect, unless somebody can show me a quote. According to Turner, neither China nor Chinese people are exploited. Literally show me where that's written, and let's put it in context. I don't think that's not a point I recall. That was not the thrust of this thing at all. And then they're sort of defending... So are they in fact shying away from the idea that China is imperialist? Is that where all this anger is actually coming from? And they're I'm not nationalist for saying so, but China's exploited. They're not coming out and saying it, but are they saying China is exploited, not imperialist, and that's actually where all this anger is coming from? Because they're saying it's not a narrow nationalist view. Anyway, in the decades ahead, China is headed toward larger and deeper crises. again, a point made in the book. Current weaker global demand has already slowed the growth of China's exports, and some subcontractors in the export industry, feeling the slowing of the global market and the pressure of growing workers' demands, have already begun relocating their labor-intensive production to countries where the wages are even lower. These changes, together with a long period of overinvestment, intensify the problem of overcapacity, which has reached an alarming scale. Moreover, as China's agricultural sector further declines from lack of investment, losing agricultural land and labor emigration to urban areas, China will need to import even more food to feed its population. Okay, yeah, I mean, again, I don't think any of this I wouldn't file any of these as criticisms of this paper. They're true statements. But, like, we have environmental degradation in the United States. We have exploitation of workers in the United States. Does that mean the United States is not imperialist? Like, what's going on? I don't know where this is going. And as China's environmental pollution becomes even more intolerable, the government would soon have to deal with the many impending environmental crises. They also talk about importing more food to feed its population. In the meantime, the Chinese proletariat, totaling more than 400 million, are more mature and experienced from decades of active struggle. From these conditions, we can expect an acceleration of class struggle in China. If we do not recognize China or Chinese people as being exploited, give me some quotes again. How do we understand the current and growing people's struggles in China? And do we exclude them from the global anti-imperialist struggle? This is some salty shit right here. And I think somebody just didn't like China being called imperialist. I don't get it. These are not points that were made. Like, did you even fucking read this is like my answer to this. I would like to thank Red Path for giving me the opportunity in the spirit of unity and struggle to voice my disagreements with and criticisms of Turner's article. Honestly, I thought that was pretty bad. And when you're going to criticize something, use quotes, because I legitimately would throw out about 80% of this on the basis of, like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't even remember that being said, and I do remember the opposite being said. But anyway, I found that, happened to find that looking up stuff on the internet, and it's timely, so there we go.